All right, folks, welcome back to Expected by Whom, a podcast exploring the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. We know a lot of you tuning in are Red Wings fans, and the Wing Wheel Podcast is the biggest and best Detroit Red Wings show out there. Find the show wherever you listen to or watch your podcast and go to wingwheelpodcast.com for more. All right, so we had another promotion announcement in the NHL, and we have another president of hockey operations. Bill Guerin of Minnesota has been promoted to not only be the general manager, but also be the president of hockey operations, similar to longtime Detroit Red Wings general manager Ken Holland, who is now president of hockey operations and GM in Edmonton. So, Sean, I got to ask, who is actually in charge? Because we're seeing a lot of these president of hockey operations titles pop up, and some teams are also having GMs. And then some teams are actually having them be the same person. So, what is actually happening here?
Yeah, well, the Bill Guerin one, right? That's at least pretty seamless. It's Bill Guerin is the GM and president of hockey operations, so everything runs through Bill Guerin. Which, ironically enough, in a kind of connection, small world type thing, Bill Guerin was the player that, in a bygone system, was the player that left Boston to give the compensatory pick to the Bruins that they used to draft Patrice Bergeron. If you wanted a kind of a small world connection to how we can connect to current events of the week, right? Obviously with Bergeron's retirement and everything like that. But yeah, in Minnesota, everything runs through Bill Guerin. Where these are really interesting to me, and these president of hockey operations positions, and it's the ones where on the depth chart, the organizational depth chart, the hierarchy, the president of hockey operations is the boss. And there's a GM who works under them. Most notably, the last two teams that won Stanley Cups currently have this system. Colorado put this system in place after they won the cup. It was with Joe Sakic being promoted from GM to president of hockey operations, but 2 years ago. And then Vegas, even before they won the cup, they had basically taken the system of George McPhee was the GM and Kelly McCrimmon was the assistant GM, and they promoted George McPhee to president of hockey operations. Kelly McCrimmon became the GM, and it was it's the space where in Vegas, if you want to use that as kind of the example here, Kelly McCrimmon is the GM and doing most of the GM stuff, but George McPhee is still effectively the boss and still making decisions on the big picture things. And it's one of those spaces where the role and how this is evolving is fascinating to me going forward, because I think we're going to eventually get to the point where the old school, and this is just my theory, what used to be the quote-unquote GM role is now going to become the president of hockey operations role. And I think Kyle Dubas is kind of running things in Pittsburgh, I think, is a perfect example of that. Right now, the Penguins have not hired a GM. They've hired an assistant GM in Jason Spezza, who I believe can't officially start working for them until there's something weird with Jason Spezza and free agency and something like that. But I don't think Spezza can start working for them formally until August, I think it is, or something like that. But either way, Kyle Dubas has not rushed to hire a GM. He's the boss. He's the president of hockey operations, and he doesn't need a GM to really do everything. And I think we're just going to keep going further and further down this line where the GM role becomes more and more of, is it a job you also want slapped on your president of hockey operations title, or do you want to give it to somebody else to either make them feel more important, give them some more money, or maybe force someone else to answer questions from the media, because there's never a spot where the president of hockey operations has to speak to the media. The GM, if you reach the conference final, just to give kind of people how it works, you reach the conference final, there's a media availability. And both GMs and coaches have to be available. You reach the Stanley Cup final, GMs have to be available. The GMs have meetings where they technically don't have to be available, but they're the ones, everyone knows where they are and they have to come out. So when you're the president of hockey operations, you're kind of protected from having to answer other questions and stuff like that. And it's an interesting kind of way of how things are going. And I'm curious to see where this starts to go in places where maybe it's not the Guerin one is what we used as the entry point to this one, because we know everything goes through Guerin. The ones that are more interesting to me are the ones in Columbus where Jarmo Kekalainen is the GM, but is he the one making full decisions when he has a president of hockey operations working over him? Those are the ones that I think, as this evolves and becomes a larger part of the sport, are going to be really interesting to me.
I totally agree, because this is something that's evolved rather dramatically over the last few years. There's an interesting article from Ken Warren of the Ottawa Sun back in 2019 when the Senators were looking for president of hockey operations, and at the time, Ken attempted to dive into what exactly is the president of hockey operations. And mind you, we're talking about an article from 2019, just 4 years ago. And at the time, Ken's saying the president of hockey operations is kind of roughly equivalent to a senior vice president or to a senior advisor to the general manager, with kind of the major aspect or the major role of the job being to be a sounding board, a second thought, an experienced hockey person that understands kind of the NHL. So in the case of the Red Wings, we're talking about a guy like Jimmy Devellano, who's been there forever, understands the NHL, can be that sounding board. But really, in the last 5 years, this thing has completely shifted to where now sometimes it's the same individual who's doing both, which completely defeats the purpose of having that second voice. Or it's like you mentioned, where the president of hockey operations actually, there's been a power shift to where they're now actually the boss over the general manager. It's no longer just them being that sounding board. And in some of these instances, it's the president of hockey operations has the final say on, what's going on. So I think it's a really unique twist on kind of how this has evolved in hockey. And maybe some of it is an attempt at organizations to try and keep all of their smart minds by, promoting, but also wanting to make sure that they still have, a major role in the office. So I don't know, but it's kind of a fascinating thing to pay attention to.
And we kind of saw some of the power struggle of this in Toronto, right? With Kyle Dubas's departure out of Toronto, where we see the whole kind of discussion in the public display from Dubas at first saying, I'm not going to go anywhere other than Toronto for a GM job, but then goes to Pittsburgh for a president of hockey operations job. And we see we get a little bit of the peel back curtain a little bit. We hear some from reporting from some people like Frank Saravelli afterwards about how Brendan Shanahan and Kyle Dubas were butting heads over the power struggle. And a lot of it, I think, becomes a space too where teams are using these titles right now. And I don't think this will be possible in the future, but I think a lot of it right now is teams are using these titles to not lose people to other organizations. Because to give you an example of just an organization I covered for a long time is the Dallas Stars. And the Stars, Jim Nill has a pretty blanket policy that he will allow any Stars employee, even those under contract, to interview for a job that would be a promotion in their career. That is the blanket policy he has. It is it's the San Jose Sharks assistant GM, for example, is Tom Holy, who was the head of PR for the Stars for a long time. And when Mike Greer, now it's, of course, no one's going to stop your PR guy from this interview, but it's just an active example of last summer of Mike Greer reaching out to the Stars to say, hey, can I interview Tom Holy because I want to hire him as my assistant GM? And there wasn't even a question. This is the Stars policies. If it's a better job, you can go interview for it. Some teams obviously don't have that. Some teams are a little bit more strict about letting their people interview for other jobs and everything like that. And I think in some cases we get things done like this. For example, in the Vegas situation, we've always heard the rumblings that Kelly McCrimmon was an assistant GM who was going to get that GM job at some point. And so by George McPhee becoming the president of hockey operations, they were able to create a spot where Kelly McCrimmon could become a GM within their organization and they wouldn't lose him. And so I think we're still going to see part of that until we get to a 32-32 spot. Like right now, Bill Guerin is the president of hockey operations and the GM in Minnesota. maybe there's someone who in his organization who he looks at and he's like, hey, this person is vital to my success, and maybe they could be interviewed for a GM job at some point. Maybe someday that's the spot where they split those, and maybe that's the day that that all of a sudden Bill Guerin is just the president of operations, or even in Detroit. Let's, for example, like I think Steve Yzerman will always be the head architect of this long-term plan. But at some point, obviously, we see how much and how valuable Chris Draper has been to this plan. At some point, if another team starts to look at, and I think it was Max Boltman who asked Chris Draper at development camp if he would be interested in being a GM someday. And Chris mentioned he'd love to be a GM someday. If some other team looks at Chris Draper as a potential GM, if Steve Yzerman just says, I know he's got an executive vice president title right now, but you know what? I'll be executive vice president, president of hockey operations, and we'll make Chris Draper our GM. That stops some other team from getting Chris Draper. I think until we get to a full 32-32 of teams having both the president of hockey operations and GMs, we'll see those roles start to kind of proliferate that way of, hey, we're keeping our people, and so we're shuffling titles this way.
Yeah. I mean, and Wings fans should be intimately familiar with this because, you know, the bombshell kind of came out in 2011 that the Ilitches had approached Ken Holland about moving up in the front office to allow Steve Yzerman to ascend into the GM role. And unfortunately, Ken at the time didn't want him to do that. And as such, you know, we all know what happened. Steve leaves for Tampa, builds a, you know, perennial cup contender down there, and then eventually comes back when Ken does agree to move up to a senior vice president role. But then 3 weeks later, leaves to go to Edmonton, you know, to be president of hockey operations and GM. And so, you know, this exact scenario has played out in Detroit over the past decade, and everyone's really familiar with it. But I think I agree with you in saying that until you kind of have 32 presidents of hockey operations and 32 general managers, we're going to have this weird balance where different franchises kind of look at the positions differently. Like right now, Detroit is very much still of the old mindset. You have the senior advisor to Steve Yzerman, but Steve Yzerman is calling the shots as general manager. And, you know, we don't have that same kind of dynamic that you may see in other areas, like what Minnesota and Pittsburgh have done with their presidents of hockey operations, and Edmonton has done, or as you referenced, Columbus, you know, being another example there where Yarmo is the GM, but you know, what's John Davidson's role there? So it's kind of an interesting human element to the front office that I don't think gets talked about enough.
There's a story I've always wanted to write and compile, and it'd be too difficult to, and it would, I don't want to say it's too difficult because someone could do it, but, and you'd probably have to burn some bridges to do it too. That's why I never did it. But I would be fascinated if someone was to make the list of where does power lie in organizations? Because like there's what's on paper, there's where these things, there's some organizations where we know the owner has way more pull. Like in every organization, the owner's important, but whatever. But there are some organizations where the owner has to be at the draft table. The owner has to get called before a major trade happens. The owner has to be in the room on free agency day. There's other organizations like what we've heard about in Detroit, where like, you know what, the Ilitches, they basically hand the keys to Yzerman, and they don't really, other than just showing up to games occasionally and doing things like that, they don't get involved in the hockey operations anymore. That obviously is something that was a little bit, I mean, they still put their foot down on a certain jersey retirement on that should be in the rafters. That's not, but that's a whole nother, we'll let the Winged Wheel podcast tackle that debate. But I would love to go through this be able to go through organizationally, because there's some places where you can kind of put the pins on it. You're like, okay, I know for example, I know that in a place like Nashville, obviously it's now flipped quite a bit, but for a long time, David Poile had full carte blanche. There was no questioning him at all. In fact, I know when the Predators waived Eeli Tolvanen, one of the things, and claimed by Seattle, who, ironically enough, perfect timing for a guest later on the show. But when the Predators waived Eeli Tolvanen, there was people in the organization who maybe wondered about that decision to waive him, but no one questioned what David Poile did. And I think Barry Trotz now takes up that mantle of there's no questioning what Barry thinks, especially with the ownership group there, where it's more kind of fluid, even with the Haslam sale going through. Where on the flip side, and I'll use this as an example, just another one from when I wrote a whole book about the Dallas Stars when I lived there, when I covered that team and everything like that. And one of the stories that I was told was about the Sergei Zubov trade. And their ownership group at the time was not very hands-on, but they had a rule that before you make a trade, before making a trade, you had to just call ownership and just make sure that it was cleared. And basically what happened was it was the trade, Zubov trade was off. Kevin Hatcher was offered, Pittsburgh offered Sergei Zubov for Kevin Hatcher. And they were like, and they couldn't get a hold of the owner. He was out on literally the story goes like he was like on another business venture, like out on the Black Sea, and they couldn't get a hold of him. And they basically made the decision of like, you know what? This deal is worth going around of just saying yes to and begging for forgiveness later. We're going to trade Kevin Hatcher 1-for-1 for Sergei Zubov. We're going to do that. And that was the dynamic there, where they broke that dynamic, and that was in the night. And now I believe in Pittsburgh, right? I think the ghost of Mario Lemieux will always be there, but I think part of there being no GM and part of this, I think Kyle Dubas is now kind of, I don't think it's everything runs through Kyle Dubas completely. I think it's an interesting organization where obviously Sidney Crosby and Mario Lemieux are always going to have a play like that. Where on the flip side, you don't have a player in Detroit who has the power the way Crosby does and things like that. Like I would love to make this list, and I'm very It's Always Sunny with like the Pepos. What's the name? I can't remember the name, but basically
Charlie.
Yes, Charlie. No, but who is he talking? Pepe Silva.
Yeah, Pepe Silva.
Yeah, Pepe Silva. Like who's? I want to draw these lines, and we can do this behind me right now, and can be like, well, you know what? In Florida, they made this move on a Tuesday, and so clearly it's Bill Zito has carte blanche.
You know, to throw it back to Abbott and Costello, who's on first, what's on second, who's actually in charge? Well, Sean is here to tell you that and figure that out. You know, folks, if you'd like to support our show, please subscribe to the Wingwheel Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Wingwheel Podcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like Wingwheel Podcast exclusive Discord, which has an Expected by Whom dedicated channel where you can bug Sean and I, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're a part of the Wingwheel Podcast Content Network. So as Sean kind of hinted at, we do have one very exciting guest coming on the show today. We will be welcoming Assistant General Manager Alex Mandrycky of the Seattle Kraken to talk a little bit about her journey into hockey, you know, what it was like managing the Kraken's expansion draft, and, you know, what she sort of sees as the best available chicken wings in the city of Buffalo. And so without further ado, let's go into the interview with Alex. All right, folks, we are back with another very special episode. Today we have the pleasure and luxury to talk to Seattle Kraken Assistant General Manager Alex Mandrycky. Alex, thank you for taking the time to join us. I know you guys have had quite the busy summer.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, busy summer and now getting to enjoy some of the lovely Seattle weather.
It's hard to beat. It's one of my favorite places that I've ever visited. You know, very jealous of what you guys have been able to build there so quickly for the community. It's a tremendous hats off to you and the entire organization.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely a group effort. I always joke it kind of stinks that our players are gone in the summer. They see Seattle when it's a little bit grayer than this, but definitely hard to beat the city.
It's
Saturday.
It's the opposite of when I lived in Dallas for 5 years when I covered there. It was the opposite of that where the players got the best of both worlds, where they would get the Texas winter and then fly to and then go back to go back to Toronto or wherever they were from in the summer. So it's like I live with the opposite there, right?
Yeah. I should put a disclaimer. We like to say that we're actually pretty low in terms of total rainfall rankings in the US. It's actually doesn't rain that much, and it's pretty nice. We don't have to worry too much about driving in the snow or being too cold during the hockey season.
Well, it's a spot where you were one of the earliest hires in Seattle, and you're one of the unique situations where the GM, your boss you work with, Ron, you were hired before Ron was even hired in Seattle. And just to kind of start things off, I've always been curious of what was it like kind of being one of the first people in the door, one of the early people in the door. And then obviously I think Ron was hired about a month and a half later or something like that. And just how has kind of the relationship with Ron evolved and with everything like that as from your journey joining this organization?
Sure. Yeah, I was super excited to get the opportunity to join, Seattle. I had been actually living in Seattle while I was working in Minnesota, kind of commuting back and forth in a long distance marriage. So the opportunity to be in one spot and get to actually live with my husband again was appealing. And also just to get to bring hockey to a new city. And I guess I shouldn't say hockey because there's such a big hockey culture in Seattle. We've supported 2 WHL teams in the Thunderbirds and the Silvertips for quite a long time. But to bring the NHL to the community was something really exciting. But it was a little bit terrifying when you're kind of signing up. Todd Leiweke, the president and CEO at the time, brought me in and he's like, but we still have to hire your boss. And your boss, kind of the general manager of the team, plays such a big role in kind of setting the team culture, both on and off the ice. But I knew that Seattle, and at the time NHL Seattle, not the Kraken, was really invested in, kind of doing it right. And I felt confident that whoever we are going to bring in would be a great fit. And it turned out, kind of after going through the interview process with different candidates, when sort of Ron surfaced as being the best candidate available, that was really exciting. And kind of it was funny. Like I joked during his welcome tour of Seattle when we announced him, Seattle, we were like maybe 20 people at the time, 30 people total in the company. So I also got to play the role of like being his handler for the weekend and shepherding him around to various events in Seattle. But that was great because I got to know him and his family and kind of him as a person, in addition to, what he would be like as a boss and general manager.
That's absolutely fascinating. And, being able to be Ron Francis's handler for a week must be quite the opportunity. Kind of building from that. One of the things that I loved is, and I think it was an interview you did back with Bob Conder after you were promoted to assistant GM, and you talked a little bit about your relationship with Ron, and kind of joked that it's one thing he didn't kick you out, but it was being able to stay was kind of a privilege. And beyond that, I think he even made a comment that Ron was more of a nerd than you were expecting, if that's correct. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts a little bit on kind of how that tone and culture that you were talking about from being what's regarded as an analytics forward organization has really been established and kind of runs from Ron all the way down.
Yeah, I mean, in Ron's time in Carolina, I know Eric Tulsky has been on this podcast before, right? Like he was heavily invested in bringing Eric into Carolina in the early days. And so that as a signal for, okay, you must believe in this stuff, because Carolina was one of the early adopters of kind of building out that department. And then also just hearing kind of the questions he was asking. And he had one Excel workbook that was like color coded. And the fact like, did you do this yourself? I said, yeah. And so nerd points. But yeah, he was, from the get-go kind of had a vision. And I think we both realized what an amazing opportunity to have, these essentially kind of 3 years leading up to launching the team. Like it was this luxury that we could build out analytics, infrastructure, the scouting staff, without kind of the day-to-day pressures that happen when you're in the middle of a season and, you're worried about all the various things that pop up while you actually have a team that's playing.
I've always been kind of fascinated by those years before you had a team. You didn't even have a name yet. It was still the NHL Seattle. And what was it like in those years, and for what you can share as far as working and building this stuff out, building data out, building out processes when you didn't have a team on the ice? Like, what was that like? I've always been fascinated by those years where you were an NHL organization without a roster.
Sure. Yeah, it's something that seemed really, really exciting at the time. But once you got into it, it was a little bit daunting. I sometimes laugh. Ron would ask, well, do we like this player? I'd be like, well, we don't actually have a player evaluation model built yet. So I can give you a guess based on kind of looking at different metrics. But as far as, kind of the secret sauce that any organization is building, like that takes time to build out. And before you can do that, you have to have data and you have to figure out which vendors you're going to work with. And even before that, or while you're doing that, you have to figure out, well, who's actually going to be on this team. And felt really fortunate to hire a great team, Danny Chu, Namita Nandakumar. We have some developers on staff as well that have just been so, important to building out this group and kind of setting us up for success. But it was definitely challenging. But at the same time, we had so much time. Another thing that really complicated it was we actually could never be in the same room as each other because it was during COVID. So Danny Chu had actually moved to Seattle and then left after 2 months because they were closing the Canadian border. No one else was actually coming into the office because we were all stuck at home. And it wasn't until actually a month before the expansion draft that we all met for the first time in real life.
What was that? I was gonna say, What was that? What was that first in-person meeting like? Because I'm sure you had this was probably all the communication bit similar like this right now. We're talking on 3 different screens. What was that first in-person meeting like?
Yeah, it was. I mean, when you've been kind of working with people for a year and a half, when you meet them in person, it feels like you know them, even though you don't. So it was fun, and it was really nice to just be in the same office and be able to get up and ask someone a question or shout across the room, versus, kind of having to send a Slack message or whatever. And our scouting staff had the same issue. They had kind of all met in passing, but everyone had been previously working for different teams. I believe kind of the first time we all converged, at least for the American Scouts, was at the U18s when they were in Frisco in 2021. So that was it's just a weird feeling when you feel like you know someone and you're like, wait a second, I thought you were way shorter, way taller than what I'm seeing in real life.
I think that's one of the most intriguing and potentially, under discussed aspects of how Seattle has built its team is, preparing for that expansion draft during COVID times, shortened seasons, atypical situations for how hockey was being played, beyond kind of the player details and obviously what you can share. What all went into just getting prepared for that expansion draft? I mean, it's such a, different concept than most of us are not familiar with outside of Vegas. And then prior to them, it had been almost, 15 years prior to the last teams joining.
I think our motto was practice hopefully makes perfect. I think I had the number at one point, kind of the number of expansion drafts that we ran through a tool that we had created to be able to do expansion drafts. But there's so many different elements to it, right? When you're trying to practice for it, you have to pretend to know the motivations of all the other teams and who they're going to protect and not protect. And I think when we did our first expansion draft, mock in January of 2020, we flew in some of our pro scouts that we had hired at the time. We didn't have any amateur scouts. We had some pro scouts doing part-time work for us. And I believe there was like one player that we selected in our mock draft in January 2020 that actually was selected by us, because everyone else had been, traded or, re-signed, or it just players. It mostly was around availability of the players. So a lot of expansion drafts, a lot of Zoom calls, and then, obviously all the work that goes in from our pro scouts perspective during COVID. And analytically, there is a challenge in that, the league was playing in those kind of strict divisions. So there wasn't as much overlap. We didn't really have as many in-person viewings as we would like. But in some ways, I think that it accelerated the use of video across the league. And I would also say data, kind of the COVID period, when a scout didn't have the ability to go see a game live. I think it got scouts a lot more comfortable with kind of using video, whether it's to supplement or replace a live viewing.
What was the, for Seattle, what was kind of the thought process of how you had Vegas had recently done the expansion draft? So Vegas came in and they didn't really, if they were using anything from before, it was in theory, because it wasn't the same rules or anything like that. So when you when you came in and you're planning for an expansion draft, do you look at what Vegas did? Do you try to ignore what was the balance of using what one team has recently done versus not falling into the same traps, or try, like, what was the balance with another team having recently done it?
Yeah, I think it gave us a model, kind of maybe what other teams might think about doing during the expansion draft. And as, we kind of saw, it didn't quite play out. Teams' motivations were different when it came time for our draft versus Vegas. And, GMs hadn't done it before, right? Or most of them. And so now all of a sudden it's happening again, 4 years later, and, everyone has lessons learned. And, so it was hard to prepare, if you will, to really know what teams were not going to be willing to do. But I think it was just about feeling as prepared as possible for any situation. And as far as, getting assets in the expansion draft, I think even though we weren't able to maybe get them at expansion draft time, for at the trade deadline the following year, we were able to collect some nice futures for the organization.
So, Alex, I want to backtrack a little bit. We had Andrew Thomas on a few weeks ago, and he made a comment where he said, when him and Sam were talking about getting War on Ice, they were looking for, sort of a third person, and they ended up finding you, someone who did everything that they wanted to do better than they were able to do it themselves. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how you got involved with Andrew and Sam in terms of creating War on Ice. What you sort of took away from that experience, and kind of what motivated you to then want to start working in hockey, obviously with Minnesota afterwards.
Yeah, I'm just so thankful to Andrew and Sam for existing and kind of pulling me along on this journey. And how it happened was they just were tweeting about War on Ice, I think. And at the time, I probably had 25 followers on Twitter. I was no one. And I randomly sort of responded back and said, hey, I'd love to help with some of the tech stuff, and got sort of going. And I think the biggest lesson I learned in that is the easiest way to get a job, even though that wasn't a job, is just to do things, right? They're we need this problem solved. And I'd be great, I'm going to solve it for you. And, I don't really have anything better to do with my time right now after work. So here you go. And that, I think, made them sort of, I guess it was nice to feel valued and kind of produce work for War on Ice, and then learning a lot from them. I took a lot of stats classes in college, but I probably lean a little bit more towards the technology side and operations and implementation. And so getting to learn from both of them, who have PhDs in statistics, and Andrew's an MIT grad, and just the way that their brains work and approach problems is amazing. And getting to learn from them when we were in the public sphere, and then eventually, I love this story, and this just tells you how great of a person Andrew is. He's talking to various teams about, potentially joining them. And basically when it got to conversations in Minnesota, he said, like, I'd love to join, but I really think that we should bring, Alex along with us, because without her, it's going to be harder for me to do my job. And so that is really, I thought he was joking when he told me that Minnesota wanted to talk to me. And I'm just so grateful to him for like giving me that opportunity and, paying it, forward and bringing others along with him on the journey. I think that he's a teacher at heart, and that is always with a big heart. So it was awesome to then get to work with him for the 4 years in Minnesota.
So we've had some other people on the show who have both worked in the public versus private, or public versus team space and everything like that. And we know there's certain things you can and can't share about what teams do internally, and that's okay. But what are some, as someone who has worked, you worked with War on Ice in the public space with Andrew, and then worked in the team space. What are some of the things that maybe, whether it's a space or an area, where you maybe have noticed is one of the biggest things that's maybe the difference between what teams was privately available versus what we see on the outside?
Yeah, I think, different teams, you're working with different vendors that provide you, more data than what's available in the public sphere. So it's nice, to be able to use that for analysis. Another big thing is just having access to kind of scouting reports. And I know that there's, scouting data, some of it is available in the public sphere, but kind of getting to walk into the institutional knowledge of, how our scouts feel about players, learning about kind of their rating system and all the inner workings of, like, I think the amateur draft, there's a lot of it that just isn't known to the public, just based off of data availability and scouting coverage and those kinds of things. But it was very weird to go from like constantly being able to get feedback from the internet, which is both good and bad. So then all of a sudden, Andrew and I are really only checking each other, right? Or working with other people in our group, but it's very, in some ways it goes like, it can be isolating, working for a team versus working kind of in the public space. I think that changes as, teams have bigger and bigger groups now. So there's a lot of collaboration, and you can, still feel like you're part of a community, even though you can't actually talk to anyone from other teams.
What, as far as you've mentioned a lot on this interview, just about working with scouts and everything like that. And you talked kind of earlier about, some people becoming more comfortable with video during COVID. And obviously there's a big part of this of using all the tools available. And I'm curious for your perspective as you've built those relationships with some of the scouts in the Seattle organization, what are some of the things that maybe you've learned or taken to your side or taken into your brain, anything that's really popped that you maybe have learned from somebody who comes from a more strict scouting background that you've applied to your thinking or how you approach a problem or something like that?
Yeah, it's definitely, I have so much respect for scouts, especially ones that are kind of out in the field of, northern Alberta or wherever in the winter time. I don't think I could handle that lifestyle. But I think a lot of times it's the knowledge they have of years past. Like, for as much as we have kind of data maybe on players, like now in the amateur draft, it can be harder to get a sense for maybe what players were like 10 years ago when you're talking about why did or did not this player make it to the NHL, even if, let's say he produced a lot in the WHL, why didn't he make it? Kind of getting to have those conversations is really valuable as we, evaluate players for the current draft. But yeah, just a whole lot of respect. I love working with our director of amateur scouting, Robert Cron. He's been really receptive, and we have a really great collaboration kind of spirit between him. Namita on our team works a lot on the amateur draft, and I think ultimately we feel really good about our drafts so far.
Yeah, I won't hold it against you for taking Namita away from the public space, because that was probably the person I learned the most from. But I've got one last kind of hockey question for you, and it's really just, in the Kraken's second season, you guys go in, you upset the defending Stanley Cup champs, you take the Stars to 7 games in the second round. Did any of that success, I should say, did that catch you off guard or surprise you coming so quickly?
I think it just, who knows what happens once you get into the playoffs. I think we felt really good about our performance, in the playoffs, and felt like we played really well as a team, got a lot of key performances from some of our players. And so I don't think surprising is the right word for it, but it was an awesome experience. It was, to take both series to game 7 and, kind of be one game away from even making that conference final is pretty special, and something we're really hoping to carry in the momentum to the next season.
Going to still hockey related, but this is more of a going to your background. As an Atlanta native, I'm curious, do you have a favorite Thrashers memory? We're going off the board here.
So this is a weird part of my hockey inception story, is that I didn't actually pay attention to hockey until I was a senior in high school. So I actually don't, I would say my favorite Thrashers memories are getting free tickets when I was in college and getting to go to those games, because I went to Georgia Tech down the street. But I would say I didn't have an allegiance to the Thrashers, which I probably was part of the problem, that they moved away while I was in college, actually. So
I gotta say, I actually did manage to catch a game in Phillips Arena, and it was a lot of fun down there. I think it was, I'm trying to remember, it was right after the Hawks, I think, had won their first cup, and Dustin Byfuglien had come down to Atlanta. And so that one was a lot of fun. But last question that I've got for you, this one is definitely not hockey related. Your Twitter bio mentions chicken wings. What's the go-to order?
Ooh. So if I'm not in Buffalo, which is where my husband is from, so I'm a little biased to hence the love for chicken wings. If I'm not in Buffalo, I'll order 10 extra crispy, hot. But if I am in Buffalo, I just order medium, because that's hot there, and you don't have to say extra crispy because they're always perfect there. So, and blue cheese. Blue cheese.
Is there a preferred place in Buffalo to get your wings?
Ooh, my husband's family is Duff's family, so that would be it. But it's hard to go wrong there. I've been there for the combine the last 2 years and have had some very good wings at every place I've gone. So,
have you and your husband found a good place that at least scratches the itch in Seattle, or is there a place that someone needs to go to Seattle, or is it still kind of sacrilegious to try to compare it to Buffalo?
I would say the best place to get wings in Seattle is our fryer in our kitchen. But no, there's some good spots. It's just hard. It's hard to compete with authentic Buffalo wings, I think.
Sean was looking for a business idea, or he was looking for a place to go when he's traveling down to Seattle next time. But Alex, I just wanted to really thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. Greatly appreciate, everything you've done in the community, everything you've done in building NHL hockey in Seattle, and kind of building a very progressive organization. So very much kudos to everything that you guys have done over there. And again, can't thank you enough for spending a few minutes with us, and hope to see the Kraken build on the success from last season.
Thank you so much.
All right, folks, that was Alex Mandrycky of the Seattle Kraken. You can definitely check out more of the Kraken games this coming year, and they'll be an exciting team to watch moving forward. All right, folks, that was Alex Mandrycky, Assistant General Manager of the Seattle Kraken. Once again, one of the smartest people in hockey, and we greatly thank her for taking the time to chat with us today. So to close this episode, we've had a couple of interesting free agent signings, one being Sebastian Aho, his extension coming in at 8 years, $9.75 million for the cap hit. One of the things that I think we've been noticing is with the potential for the cap to rise in the next few years and arguably substantially rise in the next few years, has there been a little bit of a shift in how players are navigating their contract discussions? Are they opting for the shorter term deals so that they can try and make a lot of money in free agency when that cap starts to really hit? Or are there certain players that are still pursuing those longer term deals to try and get that job security? So Aho was one that you and I were talking about, at 26 years of age, to go ahead and lock in the 8-year extension at $9.75 million, which is fair market value for what he's giving you right now. In fact, he's likely to exceed that contract. Are you surprised at all that Aho didn't push harder for a shorter deal to try and maximize his earning potential?
Yeah, I mean, to me, and this is me reading off an outside, reading tea leaves on something, you got to remember he's playing off a contract where he signed the offer sheet with Montreal. Like, he's playing off the offer sheet with Montreal. And, well, obviously Carolina matched it, and he's played there, and now he's happy to be there and all that stuff and everything. That's great. But it's to sign the offer sheet in the first place still gives me the idea that this is a guy who cares about his own personal value and self-interest and everything like that. And so I'm not surprised he signed the 8-year deal because he's a hockey player. And I think hockey players in general don't think outside the box enough sometimes when it comes to things like this. But I do think this is something where he was a really good example of someone who 2-3-year deal sets himself up to be a UFA at 28, 29 years old, and he's a superstar getting paid by somebody. I don't know if it's Carolina, I don't know who it is, but somebody is giving him a ton of money, and he's making more than 9.75 per million. Would he make more than 9.7? Would he make more than 9.75 the next 2 seasons doing short term? Probably not. But at the same time, long term, he could have really banked on that. So he was one who I thought would have been maybe looked at a shorter deal. Some other guys, it's interesting because there's some players that fell into this space where I don't think they did it on purpose. Like, I think there are some players who, like a bunch of the Toronto deals, the Max Domi deal, the Tyler Bertuzzi deal, I think a bunch of those deals were done more so where those players and their agents in the future, maybe next offseason, will look at it and look at a larger payout because of, and claim they maybe do this way. But I think those happened more by mistake of teams were able to offer we talked about this kind of right after a free agency deal. The same reason that Corey Perry got $4 million this summer is the same reason that teams could give some other guys $5.5 million for 1 year. You and I were talking about, before we recorded, we were talking about the Vince Dunn deal. And I want to kind of, it obviously ties in well to our guest on the show earlier. And I want to kind of throw it to you on that one and how you look at kind of this Vince Dunn deal and where it falls in this kind of this ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, the Dunn deal is really interesting. Again, for context, we're talking about a 26-year-old defenseman coming off, a season where arguably he was one of the top 20 defensemen in the NHL. Could have merited some Norris consideration. And he goes and he signs a 4-year deal, $7.35 million. Now, this was the first big season where he had really demonstrated some proficiency at this high level. So Seattle's sort of banking on that and seeing if they can get him, if this is the start of his ascension into a peak, or at least he maintains this level for the next few years. It is kind of interesting, though, and we don't know what goes into the contract discussions here. If Dunn was pushing for more term off of that one strong year, or if he's looking to go a little bit shorter, saying, hey, I know this is my level, this is what I can play at, let me go for 4 years, and then that way I still have potentially one last big contract I can go and sign when I'm 30 years of age at a higher cap hit. So, he was a really interesting one for me. Dmitry Orlov was another interesting one for me. Now, Orlov being 31, a little bit older, but going 2 years, $7.75 million, I thought was another very interesting deal that fell into that same kind of tier. And I have to wonder, and Sean, you have a lot more experience kind of covering these guys, pre and post negotiations, but what is the trade-off between job security and earnings potential for a lot of these guys? How does it differ from other professional sports? And, to play devil's advocate to my own head, which I feel like I have to do all the time so I don't go totally insane thinking one way, is there more volatility in year-over-year player performance that maybe favors players chasing term as opposed to AAV? And so, I'll throw it to a player you covered a lot. John Klingberg turns down an 8-year deal, $7 million, goes and signs a 1-year deal with Anaheim, and now he's signing a 1-year deal for $4.15 million. He missed, and there's a chance he never comes back to recoup that lost earning potential. So, I'm just curious on your thoughts on like that trade-off for a lot of these guys, and is that volatility why you see more guys push for term?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things that we've mentioned on this podcast, and it's one of the things that we even have this podcast, is hockey is random, right? Like it is a random sport of random events, and you're trying to quantify those events in many cases. The one thing hockey has as an advantage over many sports is the contracts are not. The contracts are solid, unlike the NFL where you can get cut. Unlike the I guess there is a similar structure in world soccer where players have that protection of they sign a deal and it's solid. But in North American sports, like other than the buyout, but even with the buyout, you're still pretty well protected as a player. So the game is random, but the contracts are solid. And so I think that leads a lot to this, where as you get a lot of players and a lot of players who have their agents how do we create something solid? How do we create a bedrock in a random sport? And I think that's one of the reasons we get a lot of the long-term stuff. I truly don't think it's because of the injury thing. I think people will be like, oh, it's a physical sport, but guys get hurt. Guys get hurt in every sport. That's not I don't think it's the injury thing. I think it's more so I can get this, and this is how it's always been done. It's also kind of goes into a lot of agents. It's for the agent. You get your client signed to an 8-year deal. You're pretty well set for life as the agent. I mean, it's a pretty good gig. So I think part of it's that. I also think that hockey players in general, don't think as business people enough times. I think there's a couple who do. But even the ones that do so tend to be the ones that they think about it with their off-ice pursuits. They think about it in some other things like, maybe Austin Matthews will be a really interesting case study when he becomes a UFA. I know they're talking about and I think he will become a UFA. I know Brad Trivling keeps talking about like, oh, we're going to get something done and work on an extension with Matthews. I think even if he does re-sign with Toronto, to me, Matthews feels like the guy who at least will go to market. Even if he re-signs with Toronto, I at least feel like he will go to market. But most players don't have that. Either they don't have or they don't care about the business acumen of, hey, I can sign this for 2 years and then maximize my family earnings 3 years from now. I just don't think it's part of the hockey view of it. I think this is going to be this is going to be a generality, and I'm well aware of that. I want to be clear. I'm not saying this with scientific fact, but the other thing is, hockey players tend to be rich kids. It's just the reality. It's a sport where the players, they come from money. It's a lot of the players, they're not being able to get where they even were came from a fact of mom and dad had a lot of money or someone had money to be able to put them through how expensive AAA hockey was, to travel and all of this stuff. And so for them, it's not about a lot of players. I don't think it's about redefining where the family stands in the generational wealth pecking order. I think that happens way more. And once again, I want to be clear. I'm generalizing, and I'm well aware of that. But I think that happens more in basketball. It happens more in the NFL, where players, because of the sport, and I know those sports can be expensive coming up too, but those sports, you have more stories of people who you could play basketball until you're 10 years old without having to pay $800 for ice time or whatever. So I think in hockey, there's not as much a thirst and a push for, well, I need to get the best contract 2 years from now because I'm already coming from money. And I once again, and I know I know it sounds like I'm covering my ass because I am, and I'm speaking in generalities, but I just think more and more about that, where how expensive hockey is, how expensive it is coming up, where it's not like, and I don't know Vince Dunn's entire family history, right? Like, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend. But I'm pretty sure Vince Dunn's family had enough money for him to be able to grow up playing in a pretty comfortable atmosphere, because that's where these hockey players come from.
You know, I mean, to a certain extent, I would almost play devil's advocate to that in that, you know, I think back to the example of Scottie Pippen in the NBA where, you know, he basically played under one of the cheapest contracts that you could because, you know, coming from Scottie's background, one of the things he wanted to do was lock up that money, that guaranteed money as long as he could, you know, so he signs a 5-year, $18 million deal. And ultimately what that means is he doesn't have the opportunity to get these massive pay raises, and, you know, get the kind of contracts that Michael Jordan's, you know, playing on by the end of his career because he is stuck on that. So, you know, it's almost like you would expect them to not have as much consideration to taking the longer contracts. But all that being said, I do think there is definitely a split between how NHL players look at the trade-off between stability and earnings potential compared to other sports. You know, we've tossed out volatility. We've tossed out, you know, family background. I don't know what the real reason is. And, you know, in all likelihood, it's probably a multitude of reasons that vary dramatically from player to player on case by case situations. But I do think that this was one of the first free agencies where I can remember where some of the bigger name free agents took shorter deals than projected. And this is strictly comparing just to the evolving hockey model. You know, you look at some of the names there. I mean, Vince Dunn was projected to sign for 8 years. DeBrincat was projected to sign for 8 years. He takes 4. Another really interesting case is Keandre Miller. Arguably, you know, the second best defenseman in New York, 23 years old. You know, he actually takes only a 2-year deal that still leaves him as a restricted free agent at the end of the deal, when a lot of folks were expecting he would get tied up for 7 years. So maybe he's a case of somebody looking 2 years down the road, cap goes up. I'm in my last year of RFA. Can I make, you know, a big 8-year contract from there? But Orlov was projected to get 5 years, Gostisbehere 4 years. Bertuzzi, I mean, he takes a 1-year deal as opposed to a longer term deal when he was a guy that a lot of people thought was looking for a longer term deal. And so I don't know what the impetus is for him to do that there. But all in all, it felt like this was one of the first off seasons in recent memory where some of those big names went for shorter term.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's also the thing we're still lacking, and it's the NHL has never had the, like I look at the NBA, when I look at the NBA and I look at LeBron James' legacy in the NBA for me is the player empowerment part of it, where you can say what you want about how he handled going to Miami and the decision and all of that stuff, but basically LeBron James' legacy is he set the stage for normalizing player empowerment of player movement. And the NHL has never really had that. There's been a couple people who live maybe slightly outside the lines, but in hockey, if you move to a lot of teams, all of a sudden it becomes a question of, oh, why'd you play for so many teams? You must be a locker room cancer. Like that's the legacy in hockey right now. You move to a lot of teams, you're either you're either the 4A guy who, you know what, hey, you worked hard and you're here and you're bounced around because people keep liking you, and you're the 4A guy. But if you're a good player and you move around to a lot of teams, you get a bit of the negative connotation. And that's why I go back to the Austin Matthews thing, where I think there is if there's someone who I can circle who has the potential to open up the NHL player empowerment movement to do more things, it's Austin Matthews. It's Austin Matthews being, I'm one of the best. I'm the best American player in the world. I'm maybe the best goal scorer on the planet right now. I'm going to make a decision of where I'm going to play, and I'm going to open the door for other people. That's why I'm so fascinated to watch the Matthews thing go on. And I know Treliving is saying all the right things. We're working on this and everything like that. But I personally hope Austin Matthews takes this to free agency. I hope he meets with 10 teams. I hope he does a whole special with kids at a Boys and Girls Club in Arizona to talk about where he's going to go play next. Like, I hope he does all of that, because that will just open up so many more things where it's not, well, you played for 5 teams. You must be like I look at the whole Max Domi situation, where Max Domi played for 4 or 5 teams or now already, signed with Toronto on the 1-year deal. I had some people who would I remember people would ask me, they were like, oh, what's wrong with Max Domi? Why'd play for so many teams? Well, I mean, it's not an attitude thing. I talked to players who play with Max Domi. Max Domi is a kind of a flawed hockey player. It's not, I mean, if you know how to use Max Domi properly, that's great. But he's not moving around this way because of an attitude or anything like that. But because of where we are in the hockey world, that's what people bring up sometimes. And I'm rooting for Austin Matthews to take it to free agency and basically player empower things. And and you know what? Hopefully someone get me back on track in this conversation right now, because I feel like I'm just going deeper and deeper down a cliff right now.
I mean, you bring up a tremendous point, because if we look at the NHL, and let's say, obviously we're not looking at all 100 years of NHL history, but let's say, since 1990, who's the biggest NHL free agent to move in their prime? And the answer, I don't know what the answer is. Is it Brett Hull leaving St. Louis for Dallas? Is it, is it Scott Stevens? Although that was kind of a weird situation with him leaving St. Louis for New Jersey. Is it Scott Niedermayer going from Anaheim to New Jersey, New Jersey to Anaheim? I'm not really sure, but none of those would be on the same magnitude as an in-prime Austin Matthews moving to another team. And that's just off the top of my head. So, folks, if I missed a free agent that I think that you think merits that, but I can't think of another in-prime guy that moved.
Yeah, I mean, it's Belfour to Dallas was a big one, too.
Belfour is another one.
Belfour to Dallas as a free agent was a pretty big one. But yeah, it's hard to think of. It's even. I mean, it's the great story about Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky was traded. Like, it's the whole thing. It's like anyone will tell you. It's like Wayne. It's like anyone can be traded because Wayne Gretzky was. That's the joke. Like, it's not like Wayne Gretzky even. And I mean, I guess technically there's always the story about the flight that left Indianapolis when he was for the 2 places Wayne Gretzky could have gone. There's the lore there, but that wasn't Wayne Gretzky doing it. That was other people mapping out his future. So it's, I
mean, maybe Jágr, because Jágr was 29 going to Washington, but even still, it never really lived up. But he's probably the only other name that could probably merit the conversation there.
Because you think of guys who move, right? And it's either through a trade, or it's at the end of their career. Like, it's like for example, like when Hasek signed with Detroit, as great as he was, it wasn't like it was Hasek left Buffalo in 97 to go to Detroit. It was kind of both sides that kind of split. It wasn't like that. So, I don't know. We're definitely probably forgetting one, and so I apologize to the person who's going to leave the YouTube comment right next to the spot, making fun of how I breathe in at the end of sometimes when I talk. So put that comment right there as well. It's fine. But it's that's NHL free agency. I guess it did have a little bit of a. You look at the teams in the late '90s that won cups. They definitely were built off getting some of those final pieces, but a lot of those guys were, hey, you're 30 plus. It wasn't a 25, 26-year-old really changing everything.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, you're talking about Ray Bourque going to Colorado. That's on his last legs. You're talking about Rob Blake going to Colorado. That's last legs. You're talking about, Hasek, Robitaille, Hull, all those guys that came through Detroit. They were all late career guys. So, that's why I do think, bringing us full circle, Auston Matthews' free agency, should he end up moving and signing an NHL record contract, which I think would be the expectation if he does end up moving, may actually signify a paradigm shift in kind of how NHL players approach the trade-off of earning potential versus stability. I think it remains to be seen where that actually goes, but I think it marks the biggest chance since the Steven Stamkos sweepstakes that weren't, because he ended up re-signing in Tampa. That, I think, was the last opportunity the NHL really had to have this kind of paradigm shift. And so we'll see what happens here.
And I mean, I guess we do have to, Tavares leaving the Islanders to go to Toronto, and he had a little bit of that. And there was part of that, but I still don't, that still doesn't, to me, it
feels lower than Stamkos for me, even though he did end up moving, because, I mean, Stamkos at the time, we're talking about a 60-goal scorer. Tavares is very good, but I don't think at the time when he's leaving the Islanders, he was one of the 5 best or 10 best players in the NHL, which is what you would be saying Auston Matthews and what Steven Stamkos was at that time.
Yes, I agree with that. My point of just like, you think of times, like I remember a bit of I guess where I'm going with this is, if you think about the drama we have of the amount of people, of how excited hockey people get about Ross Colton. So, and this is no offense to Ross Colton, but like Ross Colton signs a 4-year deal, $4 million, and we're like, oh, this is a good deal. Like, oh, we're excited. Like, our bar is so low for what we get excited about, where it's like, if a player on that standard in the NBA moved, I don't even know if the insiders in the NBA would even tweet it. I'm joking, but our appetite for this is so low, where it's like, oh man, free agency, let's talk about some backup goalies and third line left wingers moving around. Like, we get so excited about that stuff because we've been so deprived of the big stuff. Like, can you imagine and I know it would just be, I really hope the Matthews thing goes to play, because it would be amazing to watch. It would be amazing to see. And I think it's also one of those spaces where, and this is going to sound very selfish as us being Americans about this, but you know what? Wouldn't it be great for the guy who could potentially be one of the greatest American players of all time to go and do this and open the door for some things like this? And it would be great. So
totally agree. It'd be nice to see. And I think the other note we just have to add, just to add totality to the discussion before we wrap it up, is, part of the challenge with the NHL being able to maximize earning potentials in the same way as other leagues is the hard salary cap. That is going to disincentivize, or I shouldn't say disincentivize, but it's going to make it a lot harder, for NHL players to really push for what they're worth. And we see this all the time. If you're on The Athletic and you look at Dom Luszczyszyn's, graphics, you'll see that Connor McDavid is going to be one of the best value contracts, despite making $12.5 million a year, because he's worth a lot more than that. But the way the NHL hard salary cap works is he's not able to really make what you would want him to actually be worth. I just think it's something that will be important to see with how Matthews' situation plays out, because, you're talking about in the NBA, you've almost doubled the value of the max contract in the last 10 years. Now, they obviously have a lot more earnings potential, flexible salary cap with the luxury tax, but, you'd like to see Matthews usher in that new era in hockey.
I don't know the full extent of it, but I would wonder if somebody from Matthews' camp would grab his ear and say, look at how Aaron Judge bet on himself. I don't know the full baseball dichotomy of that. I know baseball has a weird service time thing and with RFAs and everything. So I don't know the full thing, but I would wonder if somebody in Matthews' corner takes a look, is like, look, here's a guy who bet on himself, signed a 1-year deal, set a AL record for home runs because we have to pretend that Barry Bonds didn't do it, even though everyone was cheating, whatever. And I'm going down a lot. I'm saying a lot of things will get me in trouble today. And then obviously cashed in majorly. Stayed with the same organization, but still cashed in majorly. So.
Well, folks, only on Expected by Whom will you get a single episode segment that mentions Barry Bonds, Aaron Judge, Scottie Pippen, John Klingberg, and Austin Matthews all together. And so, with that, you can only find this kind of content over here. So please like and subscribe wherever you listen to and watch your podcasts. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please direct those to the direct messages of Ryan Hanna. And folks, that'll do it for us. Stay tuned next week.